Hi there, welcome to my fabric printing demo. My name is Rekha Krishnamurthi and I am a textile artist, printmaker, crafter, and surface pattern designer. I work out of my home studio. This is where all the creative magic happens. And I like to work with many different techniques, tools, and mediums ranging from hand painting to printmaking to even digital illustration and design. But I especially love working with textiles because there are many different ways you can bring new life to a plain piece of cloth. And that's what I want to show you today, how I print on fabric using my hand-carved linoleum blocks. I am inspired by the world around me, my daily walks, my views of New York City, global travel, my East Indian culture. I would describe my design style as a blend of whimsical design with East meets West inspired motifs. My design process always begins with a sketch pad and a pencil where I just draw out some concepts for patterns or motifs or just different design elements. And I tend to work in shorter segments as inspiration strikes, and I continuously keep refining my design until I am satisfied with it. Once I'm happy with the design, then I figure out what the color palette is, and I'll play around with some watercolor, color pencils, inks until I figure out a color palette that I want to use. And then once all that is done, then I am ready to start to carve my design onto my linoleum block. As you can see, I have a large collection of linoleum blocks that I have carved over the years, and I'm going to show you what my process is, how I transfer the design onto the block, and how I actually carve the design. Now the first step is to transfer the design onto the linoleum block. And there are a couple of ways that you can do this, and I'm going to share with you what my preferred way is. So what I normally do is once I've figured out my design in my sketchbook, I actually trace it onto tracing paper, which I've already done right here. And I use a soft pencil. So I normally use like a 2B or a 6B, any B pencil that's soft. And you can see the lines are a little bit thicker on the tracing paper. So that's the first step. And after I've done that, I then take my linoleum block and then I'm going to take my tracing, put it on the reverse side like this, line it up properly on my linoleum block, and then take that same 2D pencil and trace over the reverse side of this drawing. So I'm going to start here, and this will transfer it onto the linoleum block. And there you can see my design is now transferred onto my linoleum block, and I'm ready to start carving. Now step 2 is to start carving. So I'm going to be using a lino cutter, and I will determine what I want of the design to print. So I obviously want the stem and the leaves to print. So I'm going to carve away in the negative space. So wherever the design is not, is what I'm going to carve. So I'm going to start carving right here and just going around my design. And that's what's going to print. Wherever I've carved out, that's not going to print. And normally what I do is I start with a smaller nib for the lino cutter, and then when I want to carve away some of the larger areas, I'll switch to a larger nib. I'm now going in with the larger cutter to clean away some of the larger spaces, and I'm going to be switching back and forth between the smaller cutter and the larger cutter, especially as I am in these smaller areas. I want to make sure I don't cut the design, so I will be switching back and forth. But you can see that I've already gone through with that smaller cutter doing those initial cuts. After I've carved my design onto the linoleum block, my next step is to do a few test prints to make sure that my design is printing the way I want it to. I'm using a screen printing ink that can be used on fabric. Now there are other screen printing inks that are intended for paper only. This particular screen printing ink can be used on both paper and fabric. However, this one is for paper only. So you've just got to read the label carefully before you purchase your screen printing ink and make sure you buy the right one depending on what you're printing on. So my first step is to scoop out some of this ink and put it onto my palette. I'm using a paper palette, and then I take my brayer and I just take the ink and I just work it. So I make sure I keep going back and forth. I want the ink to be even on my brayer. So I'm going to just play around with that a little bit. Once my ink is ready, I can ink my design. So I'm going to go in one direction and make sure the ink is on all parts of the design. And let's see what this test print looks like. I'm going to just put a little pressure on here. Okay, that's what my test print looks like. That's not too bad. It could be a little darker, so I might have to just add some more ink. But overall, I'm happy with how that test print has turned out. Which now means I'm going to print on my actual fabric. But first I'm going to do a few more test prints to make sure I'm still satisfied. And doing a few of these test prints, I can see that some of the block is printing in places where I don't want it. And you can see on the block, where the ink is showing up. So I'm going to go ahead and carve those areas away and then do a few more test prints to see if that cleaned it up. I've cleaned up the block and I'm going to try a few more test prints. Okay, so that's definitely much better. Like those little marks that were there from before are now gone. It looks a lot cleaner. It's definitely not as dark as I want, but I think I'm okay with that because I'm going to print it on my actual fabric, which is actually a hand-dyed piece. So I want it to be a little bit lighter. So I think this is going to work out quite nice. So now I'm going to show you how I print it on my actual fabric. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with how the test prints have turned out. So now I'm ready to print on my actual fabric. And for the actual fabric, I'm actually using a piece of fabric that I hand dyed using shibori techniques. I think it's going to look really interesting. It's blue, and my print is also going to be a darker blue. So I think the blue on blue is going to have a really interesting effect. So I'm going to show you how I print on this fabric. I'm going to ink up my block just the way I did before for the test print. And I'm going to be alternating the leaves, so they're going to be going up and down, and I'm just randomly going to place them on this fabric. Now, normally, if you want a more precise design, you should use, registration marks and mark off like where one design is ending and the next design is going to begin. But for what I want to do, I just want this to be very organic and a tossed kind of pattern. So I'm not really being precise as to where I place my block. I'm just going to sort of do this in an organic way where I think it's going to look good. And so far, I'm really liking this print and the color on the blue. It's subtle, which is what I wanted. Now you can see here, despite me testing it, I'm still noticing that the ink is going on areas that are not on the design. So I'm going to carve out those areas, and that happens sometimes. So even though I tested it and now I'm printing on my actual fabric, I'm just going to go back and clean that up and continue to print on my fabric. As a final step in my design process, I will scan a portion of this fabric or take a photograph, and then I'll bring it into Photoshop where I will digitally recreate this pattern as a repeating pattern or as an illustration, and then it's ready to be used by companies or clients if they want to use it on product or other marketing materials or other things. So once it's digitally recreated, it can be used in a variety of different ways. I hope you enjoyed my fabric printing demo. You can find some of my one-of-a-kind, hand-dyed and hand-printed home decor items online at Craft Boston Holiday 2021, and you can also find them on my website at divineny.com. Thanks for watching.